Renata Hayes had stopped correcting people about her last name 3 years ago, right around the time she realized how useful it was that nobody at Nexum Corp connected R. Hayes, majority shareholder, to Renata Cole, the sister who does something with nonprofits in Chicago. Hayes had been her mother's maiden name, resurrected for the trust her father set up before he died, and Renata had let the two identities drift apart like continents, mostly by accident and then, later, entirely on purpose. She was standing in her office on the 31st floor of the building Nexum leased 3 full floors of, watching the last of the December light drain out of the skyline, when her assistant Maya knocked and stuck her head in. "Your brother's pitch meeting is confirmed for Monday at 10. Marketing team walked the deck by legal this morning. Want me to sit in?"
No.
"Let it run exactly the way it's scheduled to run. Nobody flags anything." Maya, who had worked for Renata for 4 years and had long since stopped being surprised by the strange overlaps between Renata's family and Renata's business, gave her a look anyway. "You know this is going to be a whole thing." "I know. Are you going to warn him?" Renata considered the skyline a moment longer before answering.
"No," she said.
"I've warned him for 15 years. He's never once believed me." The Christmas Eve dinner 3 weeks earlier was the kind of evening Renata had learned to survive rather than enjoy, a practiced choreography of small talk and old wounds dressed up as festivity. Her mother, Susan, had set the table with the good china she brought out twice a year, and her brother Derek had arrived 40 minutes late in a new overcoat, trailing the particular energy of a man who'd had a good quarter and wanted everyone to know it. Derek ran a mid-sized business development firm out of the North Loop, Crestline Advisory, 22 employees, a client roster heavy on manufacturing and logistics companies looking to expand their vendor networks. It was, by any reasonable measure, a solid business. It was also, by Derek's own measure, never quite solid enough, because their father had spent the last decade of his life quietly disappointed in both his children in ways he'd never fully explained, and Derek had spent that same decade trying to win an argument with a dead man by winning increasingly large clients. "We've been trying to land Nexum Corp for 2 years, Derek announced somewhere between the ham and the second bottle of wine, to nobody in particular, and everyone at once, the way he announced most things. 2 years of relationship building, cold outreach, 3 failed pitches. Finally got the meeting locked in. Corner office people, Renata. Fortune 500 supply chain. This is what real business looks like." "That's great, Derek," Renata said, and meant it mostly, in the uncomplicated way you can mean something good for a person you also find exhausting. "I'm serious. This is the kind of client that changes a firm's whole trajectory. You'd understand if you'd ever worked with companies at that level." He said it without any particular malice, the way you might mention weather, and that was somehow worse than if he'd meant it cruelly. It meant he genuinely believed it, had believed it for years, the settled fact of Renata's smallness sitting in his mind next to other settled facts like the sun rising in the east. Susan, refilling her own wine glass, added her own quiet contribution without looking up. "Your little projects wouldn't interest companies like them, sweetheart. It's a different world." Renata's little projects, the phrase her mother had used for 6 years now, ever since Renata left a corporate law career to run point on her father's estate and, later, to manage the family trust that had turned into something considerably larger than a trust, were, at that particular moment, worth roughly 4 times what Derek's entire firm was valued at, though there was no way to say that at a Christmas dinner without it sounding like exactly the kind of thing her mother would have accused her of showing off about. Renata checked her watch, an old habit, a tell she'd never fully broken, the thing she did when she needed a physical action to keep herself from saying something she'd regret, and said nothing. She had learned over the years exactly when explaining herself was worth the cost, and when it wasn't. Christmas dinner, 3 glasses of wine into her mother's good china evening, with Derek riding the high of his own upcoming triumph, was never going to be the moment. She'd tried a version of that conversation before, years earlier, in a quieter setting, and had watched her mother's face do the specific thing it did whenever Renata said something that didn't fit the story Susan had already decided about her younger, quieter, less impressive daughter. Susan hadn't believed her then. There was no reason to think 3 years and more wine would change that. So Renata ate her ham and complimented her mother's table, and let Derek talk for another 20 minutes about the Nexum pitch, the deck he'd hired a design firm to build, the rehearsed opening line about operational synergy, the 3 separate LinkedIn connections he'd cultivated over 18 months to finally land the meeting with someone in procurement who could get him past the gatekeepers. She didn't tell him that the person who'd actually approved the meeting on Nexum's calendar had done so after Renata mentioned, in an unrelated board call 2 weeks earlier, that her brother's firm might be worth a look for the vendor diversification initiative the board had been discussing. She hadn't named Derek as her brother. She'd simply said the name of the firm, offhand, the way you mention any promising vendor and let the company's own procurement process do the rest. It wasn't favoritism, not exactly. Crestline genuinely was a strong fit for what Nexum needed, and Renata had made a point of never once tilting the actual evaluation in Derek's favor beyond getting his firm a seat at the table. She'd simply gotten him the door. What happened once he walked through it was entirely his own doing. She hadn't told him that part either. There didn't seem to be a version of that sentence that Derek would hear as anything other than Renata trying to take credit for something he'd built himself, and she'd learned, slowly, painfully, over the years since their father's death, that the kindest thing she could sometimes do for her brother was let him have the parts of his life he needed to believe were entirely his own. The story of how Renata came to control roughly 31% of Nexum Corp's voting shares, enough, combined with 2 allied institutional investors she'd cultivated relationships with over the years, to function as the company's de facto controlling voice on the board, began 9 years earlier, with a phone call from her father that she still, on quiet nights, replayed in full. Walter Hayes had built a modest manufacturing supply business over 4 decades, the unglamorous kind of company that made brackets and fasteners for larger industrial clients, never flashy, never covered in the business press, but steady and profitable in the particular way that old-fashioned businesses sometimes were. He'd sold it 11 years ago for considerably more than anyone in the family expected, and had spent the years afterward doing something neither of his children fully understood until much later. Quietly, patiently, building a private investment position in a handful of companies he believed in, Nexum among them, back when Nexum was a mid-cap logistics software company nobody outside the industry had heard of. He'd called Renata, not Derek, 9 years ago on a Tuesday afternoon, and asked her to fly out to Cleveland for a weekend, ostensibly for his birthday. What he'd actually wanted was to walk her through, line by line, over 3 days at his kitchen table, the entire structure of what he'd built. The holding company, the board seats he'd quietly accumulated, the relationships with 2 other family offices who trusted his judgment enough to vote alongside him on major decisions. "Why me?" she'd asked him, that first night, genuinely bewildered. "Derek's the one who does this for a living." Her father had been quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee mug in his hands the way he did when he was choosing words carefully. "Derek does deals," he said finally. "He's good at deals. He likes the chase of it, the closing of it. This isn't that. This is stewardship. This is sitting quietly with something for 20 years and making sure it doesn't get sold off the moment it's inconvenient, or leveraged into something reckless the moment someone gets impatient. I need someone who can sit still with money. You've always been the one who could sit still." It wasn't a compliment exactly, not the way Derek would have wanted to be complimented. There was no praise in it for hustle or ambition or closing power. But it was, Renata understood even then, the deepest form of trust her father had to offer, and she'd spent the 3 days at that kitchen table absorbing everything he could teach her in the time he had left, not yet knowing how little time that actually was. He died 14 months later, of a heart attack that gave nobody any warning, and Renata found herself, at 32, the sole trustee of a structure she was still learning the full shape of, holding a controlling position in a company she'd never once mentioned to her family because there had never been a natural place in a Christmas dinner conversation to say, by the way, "I quietly control a meaningful stake in a Fortune 500 supply chain company, on top of doing the non-profit board work you all consider my real job." Derek had never asked about the estate in any real detail. He'd been given a modest inheritance of his own, enough to seed his firm's early years, which he'd never once acknowledged came from their father rather than his own bootstrapping, a small dishonesty Renata had decided years ago wasn't worth confronting him about, and he'd walked away from their father's death assuming, without ever quite saying it, that whatever Renata was doing with the trust was some smaller, quieter, more feminine-coded version of business, the kind that involved sitting on charity boards and having lunch with other trust fund women, rather than actual work. She'd let him believe that. It had been easier, in the early years, to let the family's assumptions about her settle into a shape she didn't have to actively manage. And then, over time, the silence had simply calcified into habit, the way most long silences do. Not one dramatic decision to hide something, but 1,000 small decisions not to correct it, each one easier than the last, until 8 years had passed and the truth had grown too large and too strange to introduce casually into a conversation. Derek and his business partner, a sharp, nervous young associate named Priya Anand, walked into Nexum's headquarters at 9:52 on Monday morning, 8 minutes early, the way Derek always arrived for important meetings, a habit he developed specifically to project the kind of controlled confidence he believed successful people projected. The lobby was the kind of glass and marble corporate cathedral designed to make visitors feel appropriately small, soaring atrium. A wall of screens cycling through the company's supply chain footprint across 4 continents. A reception desk staffed by 2 people whose entire job was managing the flow of executives, consultants, and hopeful vendors through the building's ground floor. The receptionist, a young man named Tobias who'd worked the desk for 2 years and had learned, in that time, exactly which names on the visitor log mattered and which didn't, looked up their badges, cross-referenced the calendar, and paused for a beat longer than Derek expected. "Are you here to see Ms. Hayes?" Tobias asked. "She's expecting you. She's in the corner office, 31st floor. I'll have someone walk you up." Derek's easy pre-meeting smile faltered, just slightly, the way a smile does when it's processing information faster than the face can adjust to it. "I'm sorry, Ms. Hayes. We're here for the vendor evaluation meeting with the supply chain procurement team. Marcus Feld should be expecting us." "Marcus is joining, yes. But Ms. Hayes asked to be looped into this one personally. She's already up there." Tobias glanced at his screen again, entirely unbothered, a man reciting a schedule rather than delivering news. "Should I call ahead and let them know you've arrived?" Priya, standing beside Derek with the pitch materials in a leather portfolio under her arm, glanced sideways at him, picking up on something in his stillness that she couldn't yet name. "Derek? Everything okay?" Derek was doing the math the way people do math on faces they've known their entire lives, running the name Hayes against everything he knew and didn't know about his sister, against the trust their father had set up that Renata managed, against 100 small comments over the years that he'd never once thought to follow up on because following up would have required believing, even for a moment, that his sister's life contained more than he'd allowed himself to imagine. "No," he said slowly. "No, I think I might know who that is." "You know Ms. Hayes?" Tobias asked, mildly curious now. "I think," Derek said, "she might be my sister." Renata was standing by the window when the elevator opened onto the 31st floor, and she watched Derek's reflection arrive in the glass before she turned around. The specific stiffness in his shoulders, the way Priya kept glancing sideways at him with growing alarm, the whole practiced confidence he'd walked in with visibly recalibrating with every step down the hallway. "Derek," she said, and extended a hand the way she extended it to every vendor who walked into this office, professional, unhurried, giving him nothing to react against except the sheer fact of her presence. "Ms. Anand, I assume. Thank you both for coming in. Please sit." Derek didn't sit right away. He stood in the doorway of an office with his sister's name on the door plaque. Not Cole, not the name he'd known her by his entire life, but Hayes, their mother's maiden name, their father's chosen vehicle, a name Derek had somehow never once connected to the sister he'd grown up assuming he understood completely. This is your office." "It is. You're on the board here. I'm the controlling shareholder, Derek. I chair the governance committee. I have been for 6 years." He sat down, finally, in the chair across from her desk, the pitch portfolio still clutched against his chest like something he'd forgotten he was holding. Priya sat beside him, quiet, professionally composed in the way you learn to be composed when you sense you're witnessing something that isn't really about you. "Why?" Derek said and stopped and started again. "Why didn't you tell me?" I tried a few times early on. You weren't really interested in hearing it. You'd already decided what my work looked like, and it was easier for you to believe I was doing something smaller than to ask real questions about what I was actually doing. Renata kept her voice level, not unkind, the voice she used in board meetings when she needed a room to stay calm rather than spiral. And then it got easier to just let you believe what you believed. I'm not proud of that. It wasn't honest of me either. Dad set this up.
For you.
Not. He never told me any of this existed. He told me he needed someone who could sit still with money, Renata said. Not someone who chased deals. He said it almost 8 years ago now at his kitchen table, and I think about it more than you'd probably guess. I don't think it was a judgment on you, Derek. Not really. I think he genuinely thought your skills belonged somewhere else, doing exactly what you're doing right now. He just also thought this particular thing needed someone patient, and he decided that was me. Derek was quiet for a long moment, and Renata watched something complicated move across his face. Not quite anger, not quite grief, something closer to a man recalculating an entire decade of assumptions about his own family in real time, in a corner office, in front of his own junior partner. At Christmas, he said finally, you just sat there, while I talked for 20 minutes about how big a deal this meeting was. While Mom said your work wouldn't interest a company like this. You just checked your watch. I know. Why didn't you say anything? Because I've learned that some truths only land when the room is ready to hear them, and that room wasn't ready. This one might not be either, honestly. But you were going to find out this morning regardless. So I decided it should at least be in a room where I could explain it properly, instead of you finding out from Marcus in front of your client after the deal's already falling apart around a surprise nobody prepared you for. The meeting proceeded, technically, once Marcus Feld from procurement joined them 15 minutes later, oblivious to the family reckoning that had just occurred in the corner office and simply grateful the vendor evaluation could finally move forward. Derek, to his considerable credit, pulled himself together with a professionalism that Renata found herself genuinely proud of. He ran the pitch he'd spent 18 months building, walked Marcus and the procurement team through Crestline's capabilities with the same rehearsed confidence he'd have brought to any other meeting, and didn't once try to leverage the fact that the controlling shareholder happened to be sitting in the room and happened to be his sister. Renata said almost nothing during the actual pitch. She'd made a private decision, walking into the meeting, that she would not advocate for Crestline beyond what she'd already quietly done weeks earlier. Getting them a fair hearing was the only assistance she was willing to offer, and Derek's own work would have to stand or fall on its own merits from that point forward. It was, she thought, the only version of help that wouldn't cost him something more valuable than the deal itself. The knowledge that whatever he built from here on out, he'd built with his own hands. Crestline got the contract. Not because Renata pushed for it, but because Derek's pitch was, in fact, genuinely strong and Marcus's team had been looking for exactly the kind of vendor diversification Crestline offered. Derek would spend the following months, Renata suspected, quietly wondering how much of the win belonged to him and how much belonged to his sister's name on an office door, a doubt she couldn't fully resolve for him no matter how true her intentions had been. That uncertainty, she understood, was simply going to be part of what this moment cost him, a permanent, low-grade asterisk on what should have been an uncomplicated professional triumph.
They didn't discuss it further that day.
Derek and Priya left the building a little after 11, and Renata watched from her window as they crossed the plaza below. Derek's stride slower than it had been on the way in, a man visibly recalibrating something about the shape of his own life. He called her that evening, alone this time, no Priya, no audience. I've been sitting with it all day, he said, without preamble. I keep trying to figure out if I'm angry at you or angry at myself, and I genuinely can't tell which. Maybe both. That's usually how it works. Mom said your projects wouldn't interest a company like that. I said it too, basically. For years. I've been comparing my firm to a version of you that apparently didn't exist for the last 8 years. He was quiet for a moment. I don't know how to feel proud of you and humiliated at the same time. It's a weird combination. You don't have to feel proud of me today, Derek. I'm not asking for that. I just didn't want you to spend one more year believing something about me that wasn't true, especially not something that made you feel entitled to talk down to me at Christmas. She paused. I should have told you a long time ago. That part's on me. I let it go on because it was easier than the conversation we're having right now. Why was it easier? Renata thought about how to answer that honestly. Because the version of me that ran a quiet nonprofit and had little projects, as Mom calls them, that version never had to prove anything to anyone. The version of me that actually controls a piece of a Fortune 500 board has to be 100% right, constantly, in rooms full of people looking for a reason not to take her seriously. I got tired, a long time ago, of being evaluated. It was restful, honestly, being underestimated by my own family. I didn't realize until today how much that restfulness cost. Derek didn't have an immediate response to that, and Renata let the silence sit rather than filling it, because she suspected he needed the space to actually think rather than simply react. I don't know if Mom's going to handle this well, he said finally. No, Renata agreed. I don't either. Susan's reaction, when Derek finally told her a week later, Renata hadn't wanted to be the one to say it, had decided that particular truth belonged to whoever chose to carry it to her, was neither the triumphant vindication Renata might once have fantasized about nor the clean apology she might have hoped for. It was something messier, more human, a long, halting phone call in which her mother alternated between defensive justification. I had no idea. How was I supposed to know? You never said anything. And a kind of wounded confusion that Renata recognized, uncomfortably, as genuine. You let me say those things, Susan said, her voice tight. At my own table. In front of your brother. I did, Renata said. I'm not going to pretend that was entirely fair of me. But, Mom, I'd been trying to tell you things about my work for years, and you'd stopped listening a long time before that dinner. I didn't correct you, because I'd stopped believing correcting you would change anything. That's not. I would have listened. You called it a phase when I left corporate law. You called it a project when I started managing Dad's estate. You've had 8 years of opportunities to ask real questions about what any of that actually meant, and you never did, because you'd already decided I was the daughter who needed managing rather than the daughter who might actually know something you didn't. Susan didn't have an answer for that, not one she was willing to say out loud, and the call ended somewhere short of resolution, both of them aware that 8 years of assumption didn't unwind in a single difficult phone call no matter how much truth got said in it. The months that followed didn't resolve into anything as clean as a happy ending. Derek called more often, asked real questions about Renata's work now, genuine curiosity replacing the old easy dismissal, and the two of them found themselves, slowly, building something closer to an actual adult relationship than the sibling dynamic they'd been running on autopilot for a decade, though Renata noticed, in the quieter moments, that Derek still sometimes flinched slightly when the Nexum contract came up among his own team, a small permanent scar of doubt about how much of his win had been earned versus given. Susan remained, for the most part, unchanged in the ways that mattered most. She'd apologized, technically, in the careful non-apology way she apologized for most things, and had gone back, within a month or two, to a version of normal that didn't fully account for what had happened. Renata had stopped expecting more than that a long time ago, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that she didn't need her mother's full reckoning in order to feel steady in who she'd become. Priya, Derek's junior partner, reached out to Renata directly a few weeks later, asking with evident nerves whether Renata ever took meetings with young women trying to break into structured finance and family office work, a small, unexpected thread that Renata found herself genuinely happy to pull. Meeting Priya for coffee twice that spring, and eventually connecting her with 2 other women running similar quiet, patient portfolios, a tiny informal network that Renata hadn't set out to build but found herself glad to be part of. Renata kept sailing on Lake Michigan most weekends through the summer, a hobby she'd picked up the year after her father died, when she'd needed something that required total, uncomplicated attention and gave her, in exchange, a few hours a week where she wasn't managing anyone's expectations of her at all. She still sat on 3 nonprofit boards, the little projects her mother had dismissed for years, work that mattered to her in ways separate from anything to do with Nexum's balance sheet, and she'd started, that fall, mentoring a young woman at one of those nonprofits who reminded her, uncomfortably, of herself at 25, capable, quiet, chronically underestimated by people who'd decided her competence too early to actually look at it. She thought, some evenings, about her father's kitchen table, The 3 days he'd spent teaching her to sit still with money, the strange gift of being trusted with something he hadn't trusted his own son with, a gift that had cost her, in its own slow way, 8 years of being fully known by the family. She'd spent those years quietly protecting from a truth she didn't know how to introduce gently. She didn't know if Derek would ever fully stop wondering about the Nexum win, or if her mother would ever ask her a real question about her work instead of assuming she already understood the answer. She suspected some of that simply wouldn't resolve, that she'd carry the shape of that Christmas dinner and that Monday morning meeting with her for a long time, not as a wound exactly, but as a permanent, quiet fact of her life. That being taken seriously by the people who were supposed to know her best had never once come free, and that the price of finally being seen was, more often than not, the comfortable invisibility she'd spent years learning to live inside. She let that sit, too, the way she'd learned to let most difficult things sit rather than forcing them into resolution before they were ready.